Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of this week's video lecture. I know I have class 2 here. It looks like last week I called that class 2. Last week was really class 1, so I'm going to stick this to class 2. Anyway, today's agenda, you'll watch 2 video lectures. Right now I only have part A because I'm recording part B right now. I'll post it. By the time you look at this, part B will be there. And by the time you have watched this, you've already watched my response to the EAL lesson. That's just to share with you. You don't have to do anything with that other than just listen to me, what you're normally doing if you're in class. And then you'll read chapter 2. You'll answer questions in chapter 2. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then watch another video of a teacher pre-teaching a lesson on a short story of a sleepover and going over vocabulary. I'd like you to watch, and here it is, lesson sleepover, just the first 10 minutes. It's like the other video. I think the video is 40 minutes. In 10 minutes, you have an idea of what the lesson's about. Watch about 10 minutes, and then I'd like to know your opinion, what you think about it, and then how you would revise it to be student-centered, because the chapter you're going to read this week, chapter 2, is about student or learner-centered teaching, and what would you do to that lesson? How would you advise him to modify it so it's student-centered? And then you will respond to that in this discussion board. That's where you'll put your response. You'll post it with 300 words and then respond to 2 others. Okay, on that note, let's go ahead, and I want to talk about in chapter 1 some important things that you should know. You've all read the entire chapter, so you should know everything in that entire chapter, but there's a couple key points, and I'm going to point these out because these are things that will come up in your teaching of ELLs, and that might come up on your state test. And anything that, I'm a teacher, anything I know you will really need to know, I'll just take a couple minutes. So coming through the chapter, it talks a lot about different methods we used in teaching ESL, and the first and most common included 2. One was grammar translation, and one is ALM. Grammar translation is exactly what it sounds like, where you would translate grammar, and I know every single one of you who had to learn your L2 starting in middle school or high school. If you were lucky, you learned in elementary. You were given the blank sheet, and you had to put your verbs like in past tense. I learned French. And then you had to conjugate. It would be like je suis, tu es, il est. And the same thing with Spanish, and that's grammar translation. You were given the sheet of paper, and then you would translate the verb to be. You would translate present to past, past perfect. And this is how language was taught. It's still taught a lot like this. If you go into foreign language classrooms in high school, teachers still use grammar translation. We now know all research shows it's a really inefficient way to teach. Inefficient really for the learner, not necessarily for the teacher, but learners, of course, we understand that language is acquired. It's not necessarily learned. And this all comes from Chomsky, those of you who have that background, that it's like babies. We learn language. That you're not teaching babies to sit down there and conjugate verbs. They learn by assimilating it and being part of the environment. And this is how we want to approach our language teaching. So even though we'll still see it and there'll be evidence of it and there'll be opportunities when maybe it is appropriate, generally we no longer use that approach in teaching English. It is useful, however, for adults if they have a strong background in grammar, and sometimes adults just want to, hold on one sec, I have someone at my door. Ironically, I'm glad that just happened. That was Jen Dorr who just came, and she is the one that teaches you, places you for OPEs, that's your observation hours. And I know 3 or 4 of you emailed me, and I'm sorry I didn't get back to you, I've been swamped. She will get you a placement to observe in a public school, with the exception of you, Jennifer. We'll talk about that, to observe an ESL class this semester. So if you haven't heard from her for your OPE placement, you should be getting an email in the next 1 or 2 weeks. If you haven't gotten one in 2 weeks, then let me know. Say, I haven't gotten my placement. And Jennifer, we'll talk about yours. You can do yours in your building. Don't let me forget to remind you about that, to remind you to ask me. Okay, so adults sometimes like grammar translation, because think right now, all of us are adults. So if you're learning an L3, let's say you're on your third language and you want to learn it, sometimes for us it's easy to get a list of vocabulary and understand the rule for putting something in past tense or in future, and it's kind of quick. So sometimes adults prefer it because we have that background, but generally when we're teaching English language learners, we really kind of want to avoid that traditional grammar translation approach. The other important one that the chapter talks about is ALM, audio lingual method, ALM. That's no different than teacher, and this is kind of what the teacher was doing in the video, is saying the word, pronouncing it, students repeating, pronouncing, repeating, pronouncing, repeating. And I'm hearing the advertisement on the radio a lot for Babbel.com or the Babbel tapes where you can learn in your car. And that's ALM. All they're doing is they're saying the words and they're having the listener repeat it, and you memorize for pronunciation like that, and you learn phrases. It was really popular, especially in the 50s and 60s when they were doing military training. You'd get phrases quickly and the pronunciation down, but you really wouldn't understand and learn the language. So it's no different than me saying mahaba. Please repeat, mahaba. 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 Okay, mahaba. That means hello in Arabic. So this is how we do it. And then I'd say kayfa kalaka. Say kayfa kalaka, kayfa kalaka. And you'd keep pronouncing. That's ALM. That's how are you, kayfa kalaka. Okay, so let's keep going through our chapter. Natural method. Okay, we learn through observation. That'll never come out. Series method, empiricism, yada, yada, yada. Direct method, that's direct experience. This is it's so funny, my, one of my teachers, Diane Larson Freeman, so funny to see her name in this huge textbook for my master's program a long, long time ago, was big in the direct method, yada, yada, yada. There's ALM, Suggestopedia. You'll never use it. We had to learn about it. It's just actually playing Baroque music when students are learning and putting them more realia in the classroom. It does address the idea of students who maybe are more musical when they learn, and they associate music with types of learning, kind of like that's why they put the music in the background. You'll never use Suggestopedia. Living language, yada, yada, yada. Okay, the silent way, I had a study. Remember we did shock languages? My shock language was Japanese, and I had to learn it the silent way. And the silent way is with Gaetano, and what he decided to do was he used Cuisinart rods, colored rods, and the rods represented sounds of language, and they're colored rods, and you didn't really talk. You used these rods to create sentences, and when they were correct, then you would speak. The silent way was super popular for a short period of time. It's used sometimes, but it's really esoteric. It's nothing that you would ever probably use it, but you may come across it. The reason why it has some positive aspects is because our L2 learners have what we call a silent period, especially newcomers. When they come, they tend to be really quiet. They're listening. They're overwhelmed. They're taking everything in. And we call that the silent period. So the silent way kind of works because they're not ready to speak. Just like now, if I asked you to please now tell me how to say hello and how are you in Arabic, I just taught you through the ALM method. It'd be hard to say, oh yeah, I can do that, because you're embarrassed the way you sound and it's hard to speak up, and we don't want to do that in our L2s and L3s. So it's common that your EALs will have that silent period. That's okay. Let them have that silent period until they're ready to talk. So kind of the silent way dovetails into that. You will probably, I've never used it. I taught for 15 years. I mean, I used it kind of goof around to practice with it, but you'll never use it practically speaking. Community language learning, this is CLL. This is the idea where you focus again on a sense of community. You're in a circle. Think of the Socratic method. You're talking, you're asking questions, and you're working on pronunciation. The teacher can record you only once you have the pronunciation down. So I might have you say mahaba, 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 and then I'll record you. So just the perfect pronunciation comes on that recording. And when we play it back, you sound like a native speaker. There's your Babbel.com again. When you say it back, I think Babbel.com says, ding, 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 you got it right. I just heard that on the radio. I've just heard it a million times, so now I know how it works. Anyway, so will you use it? Maybe, probably not, but just so you know about it. Problem posing, that's Frere. Here he comes with, again, this idea of critical pedagogy and social reconstructivism, and this idea that we want to help the community and we want to improve ideas, and we can teach language through asking questions, and the idea of how to reduce poverty in Rochester. And you teach this huge overarching question, and that's problem posing. And it's good for dialogue. You can have structured dialogue. Will you use it? Maybe you'll use it for 1 or 2 lessons. It probably won't be an approach. TPR, total physical response. This one's real popular. You'll talk about it on your state test. You'll drop that buzzword when you interview. TPR is no different than it sounds, total physical response. So if you're teaching verbs, jump, then you have your students get up, jump, sit, stand, clap. That's TPR, total physical response. The little kids love it. It's really interactive. It's a way to involve. It's easy to do vocabulary. And of course, we know anything that adds body movement, cognitive to physical, helps with acquiring the language. Then we have the natural approach, and this is Stephen Krashen. And those you have never seen Stephen Krashen, make sure this is important. You get him down on page 25. His big thing, Stephen Krashen, is comprehensible input. If students don't understand it when it's going in, then they're not going to understand it when it's coming out. And you'll use him. You need a theorist in your EdTPA. You need him on your state test. And he's a really solid researcher, and his ideas are really foundational now in ESL teaching. It's this idea that, and you saw this on our first video, where our teacher was sitting in that semicircle, and are the students really understanding what she's talking about with these sounds and this list of words? Do we really think of that as comprehensible input? Do they really understand what's coming in? And it's this idea of whole to part. If you want to teach something, begin with the whole. Let them know really what the final picture is. It's kind of hard to teach this idea of a watermelon and what a watermelon is if you begin with a seed and these little tiny parts. You know, begin with the whole watermelon and cut in half and let them see, okay, this is what we're going to learn about. And Stephen Krashen brings all this together and says it needs to be comprehensible input. We need to go from whole to part. It needs to be learner-centered. So these are things we're going to talk about. And keep this in mind as you observe the video that I've posted this week on the sleepover with his teacher who's teaching this story, pre-teaching the vocabulary for the story sleepover, and this idea of comprehensible input. Do the students really even know what just watch this video. Do the students actually really even know what he's talking about? I'm going to say Stephen, and I'm probably giving too much of information. Stephen Krashen is going to say, no, probably not. So make sure that you understand Stephen Krashen's associated with comprehensible input, later on comprehensible output. We know that the effective filter, we learned this for those of you who are in my introduction to education. The effective filter, you want the effective filter low. This is this idea of things like anxiety, things like hunger, cold. If a student is cold, really cold, his affective filter's really high, he's not going to want to learn. If you're hungry, they're not going to want to learn. If they're nervous or anxious, they haven't done their homework, they can't find their pencil. This is the affective filter. That you have to attend to the affective domain. Make sure that they're fed, that they don't. I mean, how many times have you seen, and this will be to you, Jennifer, you're a teacher, students sitting there, I have to go to the bathroom, I really have to pee, I really have to pee. That's the affective filter. If that's interfering, they're not going to sit down and be able to really understand and learn language. So we have to make sure we attend to those needs. This is what the National Approach talks about. And that's really where our focus is here, is that's kind of the approach that we begin to